in El Salvador, they'll tell you that's probably the most impactful mission they do down there to maintain the support of the government with us versus Chavez. And so the key now is we do it using 3 and 4 week ATs. In the future, what we need to be using is 60 and 90-day increments so that we could give USARSO Southcom a really robust engagement capability, and we give our soldiers a mission. That's where we're headed for the future. Look forward to your questions, and I'll be followed by the Honorable Tom Miller.
Well, thanks. Appreciate everybody coming today. Hopefully, I think we'll present some pretty comprehensive stuff here on the Guard and Reserve. I'd like to start off by saying how much I appreciate the Guard and Reserve soldiers that are out there. You know, kudos to them every day for what they do, how they show up willing to get after it, and the leadership that's out there, particularly at the colonel level. They just want to solve problems, get on out, get downrange, accomplish the mission, and get back home. And I think that speaks more to what's going on out there than all the other systematic diagrams that we can possibly draw up for you. Is just the generalized attitude of cooperation out there just to get things done. Next chart. This is First Army's mission, just to revisit it. But as sometimes forget, we actually train over 150 different mission sets. We're still training Guantanamo Bay. We're training soldiers that go to the MFO. We're still training the K4. The Guard and Reserve are still contributing to those organizations, and that sometimes gets overlooked. We get OIF, OEF centric, and we forget about all these other things that are going on. Now, 7 out of 10 people won't even know that the Guard and Reserve routinely deploy to the Horn of Africa, as an example. But the reality is there's a lot of contributions going on out there other than OIF and OEF that are difficult mission sets, that are year-long deployments, and have the same stressors as anything else. So far, First Army, you have provided over 700,000 soldiers have moved through the mobilization training centers. Our FY10 annual picture is going to look at about 57,300 RC soldiers, and then about 10,000 Air Force and sailors that First Army also has the responsibility to train. These are sailors and airmen that for the most part are performing non-standard missions for their service, but standardized missions for the U.S. Army. Engineer units, transportation units, things of that nature. So the other services still contribute a great deal, and we train the vast majority of those joint capabilities at Fort Lewis and at Fort Dix. But that mission set's out there, and as well we train 500 Canadians a year, standing agreement we have, and the active duty MP brigades that deploy, headquarters go to our detainee ops training out at Fort Bliss, where the First Army Outlaw Team puts them through 3 weeks of detainee operations training. So that ends up being about 65,000. That's down from about 92,000 2 years ago, and we think that'll drop about another 15 to 16,000 in FY11. So the overall contribution in the aggregate is, in fact, slowly easing itself down. Even though the aggregated requirements stay quite large, that's who's coming through the Mobile Training Center out there. Next chart. These are some generalized observations to frame things. Obviously, there's pockets of exceptions in any statement here, but these are my observations just to share with you of how I categorize what I see going on. Number one, the joint assessment process is working very good for us. I think that's probably going to be one of the more important things that was thrown out on the table, and that's where year out the Guard, Reserve, First Army all huddle together, mostly colonels again, sit down and work out all the machinations and details of training plans, and this is what we're going to do and what we're not going to do. Back in 2008, that used to be briefed by First Army. Beginning in 2008, the Reserve Component leadership briefs that. It's their training plan, not my training plan. And it gets the buy-in to it. So we agree to that training plan at about a year out, plus or minus a few months. And so when we go to the Mobilization Training Center, we try to adapt as best we can, because you do train to standard, you don't train to time. Sometimes you train faster at the mob station, sometimes you train slower, and that's where adaptive leaders come in. The second part is the reserve components over the last year are arriving at 85, 90% plus individual readiness. Very, very high readiness standards. Last combat brigade we had, full spectrum, 2, 3, 4, Tim Moore's brigade. You're talking about 1%, less than 1% that refratted at the mob station. Most of y'all have been around. I've been here doing this 3 years. That's phenomenal. If you look back at the stress we went through during the first couple weeks because of medical readiness alone. But a lot of that's that everybody's learned a lot of things. The states have gotten much more proficient. The regional training center concept that Jack briefed to you is highly proficient in doing that and handing off what I consider ready units that we agree to. And that's what we agree to primarily at the JA, is not to try to get after collective proficiency right now, because quite frankly, I'm not sure it's really achievable. There's little collective proficiency being built in pre-mobilization. There's collective training being done, but not collective proficiency, to where that it would then cause a decrease in post-mobilization. Sometimes that's because of currency. You do some collective training 6 months before you mob. You get to do it again before you go into combat. And sometimes a lot of the collective training is done at your home station sites, and there you don't have high-end day-night live fire capabilities to where you can certify a unit on day-night live fire, which is a subcomponent of the word proficient and is a requirement for deployment into combat. So there is collective training going, and that enables the overall concept of training, but not a lot of collective proficiency to where you could sign off on it, not have to do it again, do some other task, and head down range. Nevertheless, as Jack showed you on the chart, we're trained full spectrum combat brigades in less than 60 days, and 30 of that's at a combat training center. So there's a lot of good work that's going on out there, a lot of good learning, a lot of efficient things that go on. We will continue to try to make that go lower. Personal opinion is, and I've been saying that for about a year and a half, we're probably not too far off the equilibrium point. That if you want to create more readiness than that, you want to get less days than that in post-mobilization. Something's drastic's got to happen in pre-mobilization. And most of that is collective proficiency to where you not have to do that. The manning and sourcing process remains the biggest challenge. I mean, y'all, the Guard and Reserve know that internally. That's what we observe is really the biggest challenge. The biggest challenge is not training. Training, quite frankly, we're the masters of training. This Army trains like it's a machine that I've never seen in my 36 years. But it's not training that's the issue. It's usually the manning and the sourcing and getting the plugs and this person right because of all those things that go on, and that keeps the situation slightly unstable until you do get at the mobilization station. And so until that process is stabilized, we're probably not going to make huge leaps forward in reducing post-mobilization time. We're ready to do it. I just don't think this manning and sourcing process allows that to occur as it's currently designed. And then lastly here, it's the man, training, equip lines of operations just simply don't sync for the Guard and Reserve to optimize training readiness prior to you get to the mob station. As I call it, the training vector is very linear. You can draw it out on a piece of paper, piece of cake. But the problem is the manning and the equipping vectors, if they don't intersect that train vector at exactly the right place, then you're training inefficiently. Then you're training, but the sergeant's not there, so you get to go do it again. Or you got the sergeant, but the piece of equipment's not there, so you get to do the training again. And so doesn't optimize itself. That's a compo neutral statement, though. I would tell you the ACF is challenged the same way. A lot of that's just the way and the rhythm of that the Army is right now with such a high demand and turnaround ratio. Next chart. This is the first Army transformation that we put in place beginning in June 2008. It was 3 fundamental phases. Phase number 1 was we We wrote and published a new training support strategy. That is how I apply my resources to the Guard and Reserve. It's not how the Guard and Reserve train. They have their own training strategies. This is how I apply my resources to facilitate the Guard and Reserve training strategy. And it primarily, we refer to it as a cycle within a cycle. If you have a 4-year cycle right here, you're probably not going to see First Army until you get notified of sourcing. You're not going to see First Army before that point. So that's what we kind of call it, a cycle within a cycle. And we'll slowly adapt that as the CEF requirements get higher and the DEF requirements go lower, then that'll expand itself a little bit. But for the most part, if you look at notification of sourcing, if that's 2 years out in an ideal set of circumstances, this is what First Army primarily does. And this year we primarily provide training and management assistance, help work out training programs, plans, coordinate resources. And then in that train ready 3-year through mobilization, we train and or validate the force. And then as the CEF strategy kicks in during the available year, we'll still be there to assist Reserve Component units sustain their readiness during those critical annual training periods they'll do during the available year. And all of this is driven by our 4Gen. And my requirements are given to me by Forces Command. And then I apply my resources to the R4Gen model. It really is quite simple, to be honest with you. And this broke us out of the old TS-21 concept. Some of y'all may remember that when I was the DCG of First Army in 2000. We were, you know, the ESBs and all those sorts of things, and Force Package 1, and it was a crazy way to do business. And what this did was essentially just voided that out and put a new template up there that's driven by our 4Gen requirements. The second thing we've done, and we're almost complete, is that First Army had 16 brigades at 16 locations. We're now going to have 16 brigades at 7 locations. We're consolidating First Army's resources down to a smaller footprint. Number one, it's because that makes most sense to do it that way. It's, as they say in Atlanta, it's mo better. Number two, it's a single brigade out by itself, training support brigade's inefficient. It needs a wingman. You need a ranger buddy. So at every location, there's a minimum of 2 training support brigades there. The other thing that allowed us to do was slowly convert ourselves into the CTC ethos and organizing the mobilization training centers to an analog of NTC and JRTC with an ops brigade and a training brigade. That way, every training support brigade can't do everything. Every training support brigade can't train an ESC and then the next rotation do a maneuver brigade going to Afghanistan. It simply doesn't work. So we reorganized ourselves around Dix, Atterbury, Shelby, Hood, Bliss, and Lewis. And we consider those our enduring footprint. In other locations, Fort McCoy, we left a TSB there to help facilitate Jack's training. Oh, by the way, we need that as a surge capability. We left a brigade at Fort Stewart, Georgia, because that's our only other location that we can do a full spectrum brigade should there be another surge. And then lastly, we're going to reorganize First Army into some functional brigades. Right now we're all 16 combat arms brigades, and we've already submitted our requests, and pretty sure the Army will support us as that one of those infantry brigades will convert to a sustainment training support brigade. One will convert to a maneuver enhancement training support brigade, an MI training support brigade, so that we are functionally organized just like the modular and functional United States Army Reserve and National Guard. And that'll kind of complete at the end of 11 First Army's broad-based transformational concepts. And the intent, some of the points you see over here, but the biggest thing that I would leave with you off this chart too is the mobilization training centers to First Army. Our approach is like going to a CTC. It's not like being at home station. It's like going to a combat training center. You're just there a little longer. But it is not home station training. It is a maneuver, it is a mobilization training center. And the entire period you're there, the intent is to train either at that location or prepare you to go to an NTC and JRTC. Again, we just sent 234 of the Iowa Brigade Red Bulls out to NTC did a great job out there. Remarks, I know the CG went out there himself as well. Remarks is as good as a brigade as anybody's ever seen, and came very well prepared. That brigade, for example, came in very, very highly ready, and the individual, 21 days at Camp Shelby, straight to NTC. Part of the brigade deployed straight from NTC to Afghanistan. The rest of the brigade came back to Shelby, did some retraining, and they're on the way right now. That's a pretty efficient model. They're going to get 10 months BOG out of that brigade. Pretty good idea. Next chart. This is the implementing the strategy, just to show you a little bit closer up of where we're going to put these functional capabilities at. Maneuver Enhancement Brigade, and all the associated units, engineers, things like that to go with them at Atterbury. Dix will mainly be a sustainment. We do a lot of Jack's company-size units at Fort Dix. Oh, by the way, it's one of his regional training centers, and as he mentioned, there's a very efficient handoff right there. We're having units go out the door, company-level units go out the door in 15 days now at Fort Dix, Reserve Component units. Shelby is primarily where we do the combat maneuver brigades, and the reason is because we can. Shelby offers the largest live fire maneuver capability in our footprint. It's just truly so we do all the full spectrum brigades at Camp Shelby. At Fort Hood, we've completed the transformation, moving all the aviation out of Fort Sill down to Fort Hood, part of the consolidation. It also was to get most of our training inside the FORSCOM footprint. Fort Sill was a TRADOC installation. It put that down in the footprint. And you have all the synergy of a corps being there and an aviation field. And oh, by the way, First Army was able to get 4ID headquarters, so that had a little bit to do with it. And then at Fort Bliss, which is where we do just a whole host of training, that also will be one of our contingency full spectrum locations. And then out of Fort Lewis, we train a whole host of units, Guantanamo, detainee ops, but primarily the MI because of the intelligence foundry that's located at Fort Lewis. And that's also where we do division headquarters. Now what that presents as well is that you can pretty much should be able to tell 7 to 8 times out of 10 what your mission is, where you're going to mob at. There isn't a big decision. If you're an aviation unit, you are going to Fort Hood. It isn't a hard decision. And if you're a combat maneuver brigade, you are going to Camp Shelby. It's not a hard decision. And the reason is that's where the trainers are at, that's where the equipment's at, and that's where the infrastructure is to support that training. It doesn't make any sense to try to do a full spectrum brigade somewhere else, because then the post-mob period expands because it's inefficient. And of course, obviously with Atterbury and Shelby, we have very little active duty competition there. Deploying units that might be deploying out of the active duty divisions that are there. And then likewise, if we get on that footprint, and then based on conditions, we periodically make adjustments to this and make changes to that statement I just made. But usually those are operational reasons, no other reason. And that's caused a little bit of squirreling around here and there, because it does not matter where you're from. You're going to go to the location where the mission set's at. And it still remains the most efficient way, and that is how we're training folks. And it's working very well for us right now. And the cost efficiency, training equipment alone, we were able to reduce the PTDE by the pre-deployment training equipment by 40% by consolidating. I'd hate to even add up what the cost savings have been. And then the manpower savings, because Jack gives me 7,500 soldiers, United States Army Reserve soldiers that are in First Army structure, and the reality is we have burnt them up. I mean, I had almost all of them mobilized at one time, and now we've got that back down to, I only keep about 35% of that 7,500 mobilized, so those reserve organizations can get in an R4 Gen cycle, do their other training, and then they come on, train with our full-time trainers with me. And the last point that I would, well, let me go to the next one. It's better to make it on this one. This just shows you what's going on, the math of what happens. And the point is to understand that First Army's capacity is a function of mobilization, because 80% of our trainers are the Guard and Reserve. Out of the 15,000 soldiers out there that support First Army, 2,800 are active duty. 2,800 are active duty. So it is guardsmen and reservists that are out there that are our primary trainers to what we do. And they're melded inside these brigades and these training support battalions who mobilize, or we recruit from the OWT program very heavily. But training support resources, I mentioned, depends on how many you got going on. That also tells you what we can do outside of a DEF. Because we'll get to a point right in here, there's no assigned time to that, but let's just say that's the post-12 period, to where we will be able, there'll be a crossover point to where the preponderance of the Guard and Reserve that's coming through our 4Gen will not be deploying. They will be CEFs versus DEFs. And this allows us to then switch our priority to where the DEF's always number one, but the priority may not have the majority of the training support resources. It may actually be in the CEFs and these organizations that Jack showed you, and the Guard will be doing the same thing, going on other theater security cooperation exercises. But OWT goes down. If mobilization goes down, OWT goes down. As mobilization load goes down, then I have to reduce my co-ADOS. I have to bring that down to be responsible. And we're going to bring that down by better than 60% between FY10 and 11, from about 5,000 to about 2,000. The OWTs 2 years ago were 3,500, and today we're around 1,200 OWTs. But we don't need 3,500 anymore because we're at 6 locations instead of 12. And the OWTs, y'all know, are just, and the TPU soldiers we get from Jack are almost exclusively all combat experience individuals now. Just about every single one of them are combat experience. Next chart. And this just a couple of thoughts leaning ahead to close out on and training. We need to do effort. It's been alluded to by the CG to sync Army-wide infrastructure capabilities with the RC training strategies. As a proponent for the Guard and Reserve, I'm not sure the Army's best postured with its resources and infrastructure build to support a CEF strategy with a whole bunch of units getting ready and then, so to speak, having that readiness go into available pool and not necessarily deploy, but then you have to sustain that readiness, and that readiness has to equate proficiency, and if it's proficiency, it has to have MPRCs, live fire capabilities, and we all know that's not prolific throughout the continental United States, to where a lot of units can go nearby to a home station training area and do day-night platoon live fire. They've got to travel somewhere. We got to look at pursuing multi-component training opportunities. Some of you may remember the down tracing and the partnership we used to have. I think that has a lot of merit as things stabilize in the out years to reestablishing. We've got the warfighting forums going on, so the National Guard Light Brigades are lining up with 18th Airborne Corps, and I think there's going to be a lot of opportunities of aligning those units up, and in some cases, certainly in the CSS, of going to a down trace type experience. We've got to reconcile all the training organizations. That doesn't mean reduce necessarily, but we've got to figure out, we got a lot of folks out there training everybody right now. I'm training. He's got people, I've got his, they've got mine, PTAE, ADEGs, FORG. There's a lot of training organizations out there. And what we've got to do, which I think would be a subcomponent of the training summit, is at least we've got to line all those up and reconcile. And there's no real need to have a whole lot of redundant capability, in my opinion, when it comes to a lot of collective readiness. The mobilization, the scalable MTC, what that simply means is we're going to keep those 6 mobilization training centers out there, but some of them may not be capacitied out with DEF, so it's a great opportunity for CEF units to do their annual training at one of those mobilization training centers, because then you would have access, a unit commander would have access to the equipment, the First Army trainers, so that he could focus on doing the things he needs to do. For instance, with Battle Command, First Army could run the live fire training for him, convoy, things of that nature. And then as the CG mentioned earlier, we've been given, and we're working hard on now, what I call reinventing the MOB process. I mean, we've learned a lot about mobilization. There's some things that are fixed, but there's a lot of things inside mobilization that we've got to sort out, and some of them will be real big tasks. Some of them will be policies that will have to be adjudicated out. But there's a bunch of them out there that probably can just be sorted out within the footprint of Forces Command between FORSCOM, First Army, USARC, and the National Guard. That's what I know today. Hua.
Good afternoon, everybody. Secretary Lamont, General Thurman, welcome back to the Beltway. We know you've missed us. It's my honor and privilege to be here as the Acting Director of the Army National Guard. And what you see before you on this panel is the Army team. The Army team that has put downrange the best qualified, best led soldiers in this nation's history, and I'd submit in the world. And that really is, tells the story of where we're at here in terms of after 9 years war with an all-volunteer force. As General Casey alluded to or talked about in his presentation at the dinner, the last 40 years we have never seen such a seamless, transparent Army, a total Army, the way we have it today. And I'd like to thank AUSA, by the way, also for their effort here to recognize and to allow the reserve components to be an integral part of the agenda here this week. It really tells a story about where we've come, not just as an Army, but as an organization. Next slide. This is two things. It shows the accomplishments of where we have come from, 9 years of war as an all-volunteer force. And in the lower right-hand corner, 430,590 soldiers mobilized since 9/11. It also tells the status of where we're at in the Army National Guard, and that is that we now have an end strength of 362,015, well above the 358,200 that we were supposed to have or are authorized to have, and our retention rate is 105.5%. This is the story of soldiers who want to be part of the National Guard. Next slide. This slide, if you read through it, talks about our federal mission to provide trained and ready units available for active duty for the armed forces. And it also talks to the state mission to provide military support to civil authorities and respond to state emergencies. I'd like to take a point of privilege here. We have the newest Lieutenant General in the Army National Guard with us today, Lieutenant General Frank Grass, who was just recently appointed as the Deputy Commander to the Northcom Commander. I would also invite you to attend the Director of the Army National Guard's panel tomorrow at 1400 hours, the 27th of October. And we're going to talk a little bit more about the Homeland Mission and what we've done inside the Army National Guard and as a nation to build capacity to protect this nation in the event of a national emergency or some other kind of terrorist threat. Next slide. These are the priorities we deal with every day. Having lived through the time of June '05 when the end strength for the Army National Guard was 330,000 against a required strength of 350,000, we have learned that the #1 priority is manning the force. And really, if you don't have the people, a lot of this other stuff kind of becomes, you know, a far second as we try and figure out what our responsibilities are. 80% critical dual-use equipment inside of our formations in order for us to be able to respond in emergencies and disasters. You can't go out and rent equipment when you have an ice storm that you have to respond to or a fire that you have to go to immediately. And so the 80% of the critical dual-use equipment that we have inside the National Guard now started as a function of the war fight, but it's being manifested and it is an asset for us in the Homeland Mission. Stabilization to build force readiness. A couple of the speakers have already discussed this. Inside of the Army National Guard, it takes 3 to 5 years to build back after a reorganization. When you turn a field artillery unit into an MP unit. It doesn't happen overnight. And so you ought to be a little thoughtful about when you reorganize the Guard and Reserve, because you are going to build instant unreadiness, not just for the time being, but for the foreseeable future. So one of the things we advocate is, okay, we're willing to change, but let's be deliberate about it and let's figure out where we're going. And training the force for the Army Force Generation targets, I'll talk to you a little bit about that in a minute. Care of the force, many of you know we have a pretty significant suicide problem across the Army. We've got a similar problem inside of the Army National Guard, and care of the force is a very important part of what we are doing with regard to maintaining this operational reserve. Next slide. This is the operational force slide. This is part of the discussion that Secretary Lamont talked about. We have come a long ways in this business. We have made some huge investments, but we still have not solved the critical enablers post-OND and OEF that are going to be required for us to maintain this operational force. The funding is still not in the base to support the operational force. The authorities Secretary Lamont talked about extensively are still not in place for us to involuntarily mobilize a Guard or Reserve unit to do theater security cooperation or anything other than a named mobilization, partial mob, or PSRC. And then, frankly, the rest of this goes to the national will, and those questions in the bold box down there talk to the national will. Whenever I get the opportunity to stand in front of a Guard or a Reserve component audience, I ask them, so, okay, are you signed up for this? Do you believe in this operational reserve? Do you believe in this operational force? Are you ready to be deployed or mobilized in the objective state of the Army Force Generation model, 1 in 4 or 1 in 5? And I get about 3 answers. First of all, for the young soldiers that came into the National Guard looking for adventure, the response is, you bet. That's what I signed up for. I want to do something. I want to go somewhere. I want to be useful. I want to do something for the nation. For the leaders and the senior soldiers, senior people I see in the audience, they're normally the battalion commanders, the command sergeant majors, the platoon sergeants. Absolutely. That's what they've spent their career training for. They want to be part of that. The people in the middle, the E6s, the guys that were the adventurous, now 12 years into their career, have a job, have a family, second, third time downrange, yeah, not so much. And I tell you, we are going to lose those soldiers in a minute if we don't continue to challenge them. And the challenge is going to be just as much in a DEF or more so in a CEF. What do we do with these soldiers in a contingency expeditionary force environment? I'd tell you that when they do theater security cooperation, when they go downrange and they support state partnership programs or they are involved in operations in Haiti and they feel like they've done something, they'll stay with us. If they are sitting on their duffel bag somewhere and they are at Camp Swampy and they're not doing anything, they'll leave us in a minute. So that's our challenge in the leadership, is to make sure that we take care of our business and make that happen for them. Next slide. This is the manning, equipping, and ready force slide. Chief of Staff of the Army observed in front of the ARFPIC here about 3 months ago, he said, I've come to the conclusion that it isn't full-time manning that builds readiness in the reserve component, in the Guard and Reserve. It's not resourcing that builds readiness inside of the reserve component. It is manning. It is manning the force in a timely manner to train them and deploy them. And that really is going to be our challenge. And as you look at the manning strategy here for us, and by the way, really we haven't figured out whether this objective Army Force Generation model works yet. We've not gotten to the objective Army Force Generation model yet. We've got the 45th Brigade out of Oklahoma that's getting ready to go to the mobilization station here in 2 months. They will have only been home for 28 months. They haven't even met the 3-year dwell yet, and we are going to deploy those soldiers downrange. Our aviation units right now are at a dwell of 2.8, 2 years and about 10 months. And it's about to go to 2.3 because the aviation op tempo is not going to go down, it's going up. Now, to General Casey's point, we do have organizations and units inside of our formations that are attaining dwell. But those are two examples of where we're at right now and point up the fact that we haven't quite got to where we want to be in this Army Force Generation model yet. General Orr is going to talk about a little bit about this institutional cross-leveling or unit plug process of cross-leveling. A couple of years ago, General Vaughn talked about our formations had somewhere between 20 to 30% of the soldiers inside of the formations that were non-deployable. That hasn't changed. We still have about 20–25% are not deployable. And that's because they haven't been to basic training. We've got some medical issues out there. So how do we solve that problem in a thoughtful way? We think the way to do that is with institutional cross-leveling, putting unit plugs into units that are going downrange. If you have a brigade that's going downrange, marry it up with a battalion that is coming from another state, another unit, and that makes a complete unit, and they meet the requirement in terms of the personnel readiness as they go out the door. In the case of the 2nd to the 34th, they drew a unit plug from Iowa. The RISTA out of the 67th Brigade, or Battlefield Surveillance Brigade, went downrange with the 2nd to the 34th. That unit plug came with a battalion commander, a battalion command sergeant major. They were a team. It wasn't the eaches or individual cross-leveling that we did in an emergency situation when we first started into this. Equipping. Since 2005, this nation has made a $37 billion investment in the National Guard. $37 billion worth of equipment. We have waves of equipment coming into the Army Guard. Best ever. And if we can't figure out how to access the Guard in this process, our problem is going to be that $37 billion is going to be a wonderful situation for emergencies and disasters, but it's not going to help in terms of the federal warfight. So we want to be accessible, and we want to be available. Finally, I'll be followed by Brigadier General Orr. He's got some real-world experience from the perspective of the TAG of Iowa and a former commander of the 2nd to the 34th Brigade.
Thanks, sir. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I came here to the conference with the idea that I was a participant, like you out in the chair, and my staff said, "What are you doing speaking?" I thought you were just going to be here to watch. When you end up being the last one that stands up at the RC dinner, the Force Command Commander looked over and says, "You're it. Be prepared." So here we are, and I'm going to give you a perspective of the state of Iowa, but understand where I come from. This represents all 54 states, territories, and District of Columbia because it's really a good news story. We're a state of 7,400 soldiers. Right now, we're currently, our soldiers are really don't know anything different than this ARFRGen, what we call force generation, objective force, whatever you want to call that. We have over 15,000 soldiers that have deployed in support of the war since the beginning. Right now, we're currently getting or in the process of sending over 3,500 soldiers. That includes the 2nd Brigade Combat Team, an Ag Development Team, an Aviation Unit, and it goes on and on and on. That's over half our force structure, which is the largest deployment that we're experiencing since World War II. And yet we've been doing this with 100% force, with a less than 15% attrition rate, as General Carpenter talked about, and we have folks beating at the door to get in. And so it's interesting, the dilemma is every day I get asked about the operational force. And as you look at the 2nd Brigade Combat Team, the battalion commander 2 years ago or 3 years ago is now the brigade commander and his sergeant major are now on their 4th deployment. And they are also, both of those individuals were part of the 22-month deployment with the 1st Brigade Combat Team. And so, and yet here they are back with a lot of their leadership team. The success story here for us is really a lot of things, and part of that goes with the change in the MOB process and the procedures that we've been working with. Ray talked about the plug of the Nebraska unit into Iowa. Firm believer that really works well for our state. We came in with a notification of sourcing 2 years out, so we had ample time and opportunity to begin to work the challenges of getting our soldiers medical and dental readiness, our families and our employers. We also were able to get our soldiers prepared through a state annual training, and also we had the PTAE heavily engaged. That effort and that result put us into basically the MOB station with less than 35 days with an SRC, followed on to immediate deployment to a MRX at the 3 weeks at the NTC, and we are now deploying units either from the NTC or we're currently moving them back to Shelby, and they're moving as we speak. You know, part of this, I would tell you, is the challenge is that when you take a state our size and you deploy pretty much 3,500 soldiers, we touch every community in the state of Iowa from this deployment. Yet we have no issues that we're seeing with our families and our employers on the front end. Now, I'm then realistic in saying that we'll have some issues like any organization. But the point of this is that we've been very supportive all the way along, and it continues to be this. And I'll talk just a minute here on what I believe are some thoughts on the ARFAGEN. You know, I know it's early in the ARFAGEN process, but let me tell you, I think it's the right model, personally, the 5-year model for our soldiers, our families, and our employers. It gives us the predictability that we need. It allows for a seamless effort from going from the part-time to the full-time aspect. It is an opportunity to periodically continue to exercise the experiences that we've seen with these soldiers, and we're seeing it time and time again. And we've really seen it in our state in the last 2 years with state emergencies, in the fact that our soldiers, because of their wartime experience, are hitting the ground running, where in '93 it took us a little longer for our major flood exercise and a major disaster. And so we believe that it's relevant to our state mission on these deployments and the readiness that we're seeing. Now, some keys to the success of the ARFAGEN is the 2-year sourcing, the notification of sourcing 2 years out, so that we can organize, man, equip, and train. The medical and dental care, we need to move to the 12-month window versus 6 months. That is the bottleneck that we continue to experience, and that comes with alert. Our challenge in the second BCT was equipment. We spent the last year working every weekend and every day fielding new pieces of equipment during the last year, at the same time trying to do collective training. We got it done, but the challenge is we exercised our families and our employers tremendously on the front end, and it really needs to be slid to the first year of that 2-year notification. The joint assessment process that General Miller talked about needs to continue. Great effort. It really laid a synchronized roadmap, and our team felt very synchronized from the very beginning with the First Army and their team. And then last, the PTAE, the element that we used to train and prepare our soldiers every weekend. I think it was a success story, because I think the numbers reflect it when you look at General Miller's stats as we rolled in through that 35 days of training. As we move to the CEF and DEF, you know, I would tell you that we see this tied to the national will. You know, prior to the war, we did CEF missions. We did them every day. They were called state emergencies, natural disasters, the state partnership, med readies. We've been doing these. And then we picked the war up and we started going into the DEF. I believe the challenge for us in the future is proportional deployment in the DEF role. You know, we've worked so hard to build the readiness of our combat leaders and our soldiers. And I would believe that if we move strictly to a CEF mission, what we will find is the will of our families and our employers and our communities in Fort Iowa and every other fort is you're going to find that they're not going to be as supportive if they're not tied back to the war fight in some degree. So I would just tell you the experience that we've gained is because we've deployed soldiers to the fight, and I would just ask that that's where we need to continue. Some of the challenges and opportunities, and then I'll get off the podium, is one is this myth that comes out about our governors not allowing us to deploy for state for the state response. I'm state is no different than any other, and we do this internally. When we got notified of the 2nd Brigade deployment, we rallied 13 states around us immediately, and we held a flood summit. And we basically talked about how do we support each other when Iowa loses over half their force structure. And to this day, we have compact agreements, we have commitments, and we exchanged information so that we can handle that. And I think that's how it's done, and it's done in every state that way. Under the standardized BOG and policy shift, I know that's a discussion. The 9 months is out there. I think we do have to have a discussion at the national level on what the BOG is going to be for the future. The assured access, accessibility, what contributes to access? Well, I would tell you is we have been accessible from the very beginning of the war, and I think you'll see that in every mission that we've been asked to do. The challenge is the future and the authority level as we move to the other missions, and so there'll be continued discussion in the national level. And then the last thing I would tell you is the stability of the force structure that General Carpenter talked about is as we move structure around and change it, it takes us time. You know, and probably the nemesis for the 2nd Brigade was our intel. You know, we stood up a BCT less than 3 years ago without a MICO, and we came in pretty weak in that aspect. And I will tell you that's significant. And so we got to just make sure that we don't continue to move the structure. And then the resourcing that we have received from families, the soldier support, and finally our ESGR is crucial for our ability to continue to sustain the deployment.